This video will be part 3 of my coverage of Sigmund Freud and psychoanalysis for PSY 230 personality theory. In this part of the presentation, I'll be covering the part of Freudian theory that is probably the most controversial and that has received the most criticism, and that would be the theory of psychosexual development. And you will recognize the language that is used in Freud's depiction of psychological development. Concepts like being anal retentive, for example, have become incorporated into popular culture and remain in use today. So first, we need to kind of lay out the basic logic that Freud used. And I use the word logic loosely because sometimes the logic isn't very logical, but you kind of have to agree to set aside some of the more bizarre qualities of Freud's ideas and think about the process that he is proposing, because there are things about the process that make sense in terms of the way we look at kids from infancy through puberty, and other things that make completely no sense. So first we need to lay out the basic logic that Freud was proposing, and it starts with this concept called fixation. And Freud believed that if development moves through a series of stages, and if a person doesn't experience the healthiest options in that stage, like through their parenting interactions, through other kinds of exposures that they have to experiences, if things don't go right, then the person gets psychologically stuck at that stage, and that refers to fixation. Freud argued that certain characteristics, certain psychological clusters of attributes, certain kinds of cognitive characteristics and fantasies and wishes become attached to those fixations. And that is what causes people to be different from one another in adulthood. So what you end up with is individual differences in the Freudian model are produced by this fixation process. So to use the language used by your authors, fixation is caused when parents either, and this goes back to part 1 of the lecture on this chapter, where you have those impulses that are couched in the id. If parents either give in too much to the impulses that are coming to the surface and being expressed in the child's behavior, if they overindulge those impulses by giving the child too much power, or if they underindulge by being too restrictive of the child's pursuit of impulse satisfaction, that can cause fixation. Things will get more specific. I'll give more examples of this as we go through the specific stages. But for now, just think the impulses of the id in the growing and developing child, parents can make mistakes in one of two ways. They can either be too permissive or they can be too restrictive. Either way, if they overindulge or they underindulge, that causes the person to be stuck at that stage. And what that means is that the person will carry forward the characteristic defenses, psychological defenses and behavior patterns and wishes and fantasies that are characteristic of that stage. These defenses that are fixated, they ultimately become character traits, attributes, characteristics, the kind of adjectives that you use to describe people and the way that they differ from one another. So starting with the earliest stage, that Freud referred to this as the oral stage. And, right off the bat, this is where Freud's theory kind of makes people go, that's just kind of gross. Because what Freud argued was that at each stage, there is a physical behavior pattern and a physical area of the body that is associated with the most sort of direct kind of physical satisfaction. So, in this earliest infancy stage, Freud argued that it's really about eating. It's really about satisfaction that comes through the mouth. So he refers to it as the oral stage. And then he kind of goes back to this idea that, the primary experiences of infants are in being held, being comforted, being breastfed, being snuggled, being rocked. So all of these are very close physical interactions, and in his description of it, primarily between the mother and the infant. He argued that the physical act of feeding the baby and the fact that infants tend to put pretty much everything in their mouth until they, move on to the next stage. He argued that this reflected this very primitive satisfaction of the id impulses associated with what would later become more overt adult-style sexual satisfaction. So his suggestion is that what you're seeing in infants in terms of their literal drive to get oral satisfaction will later be translated into something more mature unless the person is fixated at that stage. So to give you the basics of the oral stage, it starts at birth. The basic drive is not so much social or interpersonal, but it's associated with making sure that they get nourishment. And the tension, the physicality of the tension is about hunger, thirst, fatigue. But I would also argue that Freud also talked about just the physical comfort of warmth. And in some ways he discussed the fact that, mothers caress their infants, that there's touch as well. But it's really primarily about eating and that intense sort of physicality of that experience. He argued that during feeding and when going to sleep, the child is soothed, they're warm, they're rocked, and there's a powerful emotional connection there for infants. So what the child is learning through that experience is that pleasure is associated with acts of feeding, of eating, of being soothed, of being rocked, being cuddled. All of those are associated with the satisfaction of these basic impulsive drives. Now later, he argues that in addition to the libido energy that in later stages becomes overtly sexual, you also have gratification of the aggressive instinct. And here's one of those areas where developmental psychologists today just sort of shake their heads and go, no. He made this statement that, at some point during breastfeeding, the child will start to bite. And he argued that that was an id impulse toward aggression. And it was spurring this infant in the direction of separation from the mother by encouraging her to reject the child through biting. Now, modern developmentalists don't buy that argument, nor do they buy the argument that some make that breastfeeding itself is a sexual act. Actually, Freud never directly argued that. He hinted at it being a primitive form of sexual gratification, but if you really read a good translation of Freud, he's not quite so direct as many people believe he was about talking about what's going on in the head of an infant. he didn't really believe that an infant was having overtly sexual thoughts about its mother. Instead, what he's talking about is, these repositories of energy, they change in shape and form over the course of development. Oral gratification in Freud's description, he argued that it becomes pathological if that is the only pathway through which the person can feel a reduction of anxiety, a reduction of tension, a reduction of discomfort. So if a person goes beyond the oral infancy stage but maintains this very strong need for oral gratification, then it can become pathological. And certainly if the person's fixated at that stage and they grow into adulthood, that's what would occur. So what happens if you are fixated at the oral stage? If fixated at the oral stage, what you carry forward is, as Freud would describe it, behaviors and wishes, fantasies that involve taking would be one direction and receiving would be the other direction. So on the receiving end, you have the more libidinal side. On the taking end, you have the more aggressive side. With each stage, Freud argued there's an erogenous zone, meaning a zone of the body where physically is associated with the reduction of tension and the experience of pleasure. So there are two versions. He referred to oral incorporative, the receiving, and oral aggressive, which would be the taking. On the receiving end, you have these various dimensions. You have optimism, gullibility, and passivity, representing oral incorporative patterns, and pessimism, suspiciousness, and manipulativeness, representing the aggressive pattern. The characteristic defenses that are associated with the oral character, and is an assumption that the earlier the fixation occurs, the more kind of twisted the defenses are. And by twisted, I mean the greatest degree of distortion of reality in the defense itself. So for the oral character, projection, denial, and introjection are associated with oral fixation. In projection, you are projecting emotions that you are experiencing onto other people. So if I'm actually angry with another person, shame and guilt associated with that anger may encourage me to project it onto the other person and say they're angry with me when they're not. It's actually my anger. Denial involves suppressing awareness of anxiety associated with various experiences. And introjection is a very complicated defense where you are, in order to cope with impulses that you have that you find unacceptable, you do a rather elaborate in a psychological sense, not in a play acting sense, but attempting to incorporate an entire new set of attributes and characteristics, even elements of identity that you feel would be more acceptable to other people. In the anal stage, and off to the left here, you're probably unfamiliar with these two characters from TV from my childhood, from The Odd Couple of Felix and Oscar. And there are many, many, many other combinations like this that really do represent this anal stage of development. At the anal stage, and again, for lots of us, if you weren't already kind of weirded out by the oral stage, you're going to get weirded out by the anal stage. But ask parents, ask people who have lived with children between 18 months and 3.5, 4 years of age. So, roughly between 2 and 4. Your life as a parent of a 2-year-old It really revolves around the potty and toilet training your child, getting them to remain clean and to urinate and defecate in appropriate locations and in appropriate ways. So your life is pretty much 24/7 dominated by whether or not you can teach your child to have self-control in these particular areas. So Freud is kind of tapping into the fact he had, children, so and he was an observer of them, and he knew that other people like him and other parents around too, that's really what you're spending most of your time doing is potty training. So he starts with that and then links it to his ideas about psychological functioning. So this idea of physiological control over the body is connected to cultural messages, interpersonal messages about what's disgusting and what's not, what's socially appropriate and what's not. And the idea that if you don't have physiological control over these basic functions, that you are dirty, that you're bad. So these ideas that, your parents can shame you, that other people can shame you, that your little tiny peers in preschool can shame you if you wet your pants or you defecate in your pants. The idea that adults can make you feel either good or bad depending on your ability to accomplish these tasks. Freud was really tapping into that idea that as kids gain control, they're having to figure out psychologically what that means, while simultaneously feeling like they're vulnerable to being punished by people who find them dirty or disgusting when they fail to control themselves. They also have power when they learn that everybody jumps when they have a bowel movement in their pants. They learn about that kind of powerful social interaction that's centered around their ability to control themselves physically. Freud drew this distinction between the clean, the overwhelmingly clean and tidy and neat, and the rewards that come with that, versus the punishments that can be associated with being slovenly and dirty. The Odd Couple, which was originally a stage play, I believe, involves this very, very, very neat, tidy, very restrictive, very particular person versus his best friend, who is a slob, who drinks too much, who smokes cigars, who is unkempt and unclean, and in some ways morally a little shady as well. And Freud was really kind of tapping into this cultural motif that you can either be one way or the other, and neither one is particularly healthy. So Freud argues that both of these extremes, either being extraordinarily particular and clean and neat and on time and so on, that can be too extreme. So can the opposite of being slovenly and filthy and late and irresponsible. Now, here's a more modern, in addition to the Odd Couple, you have other odd couples. The Sesame Street characters is another set of characters that are often used as a metaphor for what Freud was talking about in terms of the anal character. He described someone who is fixated. So, here's how parents can do the oral stage wrong. You can either overindulge, be too permissive, or you can underindulge, be too restrictive. If parents try to toilet train too early and they're too punitive, that could result in fantasies and so on that are associated with holding. If instead you are too permissive, you wait and wait to toilet train, so you're toilet training late, and you are completely uncritical in trying to require that the child meet these goals, that can lead to more slovenly patterns of behavior. So the actions and fantasies, the behaviors and wishes are associated with giving and withholding. The anal area, and this is where, you kind of get the ew factor going. The anus is seen by Freud as the erogenous zone. Now, most modern developmental psychologists are like, erogenous? Not so much. Although there are some who will argue that there is an analogous pattern of behaviors. Now, if you took my human sexuality class, we would dig into that a bit more in adult sexuality. But that's a topic that's kind of beyond the scope of this course. For Freud, though, suffice it to say, he saw this as a stepping stone that needs to be grown away from in order to achieve adult sexual satisfaction. So he argued that, kids at this age move from a focus on urination and defecation as a source of great, simultaneously, pleasure and guilt. They should grow beyond that and then move toward more mature forms of sexual arousal and satisfaction. So fixation here can either go in one of two directions, and again, it's associated with either parental overindulgence or underindulgence. So the expulsive, anal expulsive, yes, I'll just wait a second while you cleanse that image out of your mind. That is the giving pattern, and that's when parents have been too permissive. So late training, not enough guidance, not enough structure. The opposite is when parents are too punitive and too restrictive. That leads to the anal retentive, to the neat freak, to the person who is obsessively clean, tidy, and restrictive. So the traits on the side of anal retentive, you have stinginess, orderliness, and punctuality. Whereas on the expulsive side, you have someone who overindulges, who's messy, who's late, and so on. The defenses, and remember, the earlier the stage, the more distortion of reality in the defense mechanism. So this set of defenses, not quite as distorting as those associated with the oral character. Things like intellectualization, where you are giving false but more acceptable explanations for what you do. Reaction formations involve kind of transferring your knowledge of the underlying impulses that you're experiencing and replacing them with the opposite. So, for example, someone who has really intense sexual impulses may transform those into embracing an extraordinarily pious and celibate lifestyle as a way of reacting against those impulses. Isolation involves creating an artificial separation between these unacceptable impulses and the emotions that are attached to them. And undoing, which is mentally kind of not resetting, but attempting to wipe out the bad thoughts. So it's often ritualized, taking ritual actions or ritual thoughts that are designed to make up for the things, the impulses that are so anxiety provoking. So such as saying internal thoughts that go against the impulse that you have in your head. The next stage, and this is the stage that, if Freud wasn't already in trouble, this stage would get him in more trouble, is the phallic stage. So as the name implies, he argues that this is the stage, so we're hitting after 4, 5, 6, 7-ish, maybe even a little older, where kids, they're fully aware by that point in time that culture is obsessed with gender and with whether you're a boy or a girl. And for Freud's time period, it really was just whether you're a boy or a girl. His theoretical ideas were at a point in time where there wasn't language within his field, medicine, to talk about anything beyond that. And also, he was very male-centered in his approach, so he calls it phallic, which represents the image of male genitalia as the norm. And that it'll become clear, as we move through this, why I've made that statement as a starting point. But just to show you kind of the fact that Freud, even in his most criticized ideas, his ideas have still gotten into popular culture. Here's an example.
Then one day, fathers discovered from now on, fathers and sons can fight on equal terms. Men can now take revenge and win back their wives. Fight for kisses.
So this was an ad campaign from several years ago. I don't believe it ran very much in the United States, but more common in Canada and Europe. Regardless, what you see here is a very phallic stage representation of Freud's ideas about what happens to little boys as they move away from being, the image here is of a diapered baby because it's funnier, but for Freud, you have a 4-year-old, 5-year-old boy, and he starts to see his father as a rival for his mother's affection. And he sees his father as strong and powerful and capable of, number one, taking mom back, and number two, of harming him by turning him into a girl. Yeah, I have to take a deep breath after that because, the story just gets weirder from there. Suffice it to say, this storyline of little boys being attached to their mother and then developing a pseudo-sexual attachment to their mother and then being tempted to have a more than pseudo-sexual attachment to their mothers is something that has gotten into our culture. Now, Freud, it wasn't like Freud was the first one to think of this. In very ancient plays like Oedipus, the idea of boys somehow becoming sexually involved with their mothers has been a part of mythology from the beginning of humankind. So Freud wasn't the originator of this idea, but he kind of took it to the next level. So in the phallic stage, and I'm going to try and give you, the straight Freud version, but then a reinterpretation that kind of fits with what developmentalists actually see and how kids actually behave. So we're talking kids between 4, 5, 6, 7-ish. The phallic stage for Freud, and again, by calling it the phallic stage, the male experience is the norm. The female experience is a lesser modification of that male experience. So here, boys and girls become aware that males and females have different genitalia. And for Freud, it was who has a penis and who doesn't, because he has a very male-centered set of ideas. So boys recognize dad has a penis, I have a penis, mom doesn't have one, and dad's kind of running the show. And these other girls around me, they don't have anyone a penis either. So the boy is simultaneously learning that he has this organ that his powerful, all-powerful father has. And for Freud, he says that these boys start to give a great deal of meaning to these sexual differences. So they're learning about gender roles, like who's in charge of what at home, and what does that mean? Where's the power and the decision making in their sphere of experience? Freud argued that boys learn to associate power and control with the fact that they are male, physically male, and then to look at the possibility of their father being a rival for the attention and affection and connection that they already have to their mother. Now for Freud, he believes that the tension comes from this fact in his mind, that boys need to learn to be uncomfortable under the touch of their mothers, that they have to learn to be uncomfortable when touched by, held by, kissed by, caressed by their mother, particularly in their genital areas. So they have to learn to detach from their mother, while at the same time, she is their primary attachment object. She is the person that they are the physically most close to. In the Freudian era, during the time when he was writing, fathers took typically, at least in Freud's socioeconomic level, took very little role in physically caring for children. They may play with them, they may engage them in fairly distant ways, they may discipline them, but they were not doing the day-to-day, the feeding, the caring, the cleaning kind of activities. So for Freud, he believed that boys were facing tension because they want that physical closeness to their mothers, but simultaneously they learned that their father is all powerful. They want the kind of control that he has, but they don't want to lose their mother. So he argued that they have this sort of tension associated with this very twisted perception of relationship with their physical relationship with their mother. So in the energy, the excitement in the child's mind is associated with the physical connection between the child and each parent individually. So the child is like, I want to be like my dad, but I want to be with my mother. I want to be like my dad, but I want to be with my mother. And these are seen as inconsistent with one another. And they get convoluted with what Freud believed was a very nascent sexual attraction to mother. So what the child becomes is jealous when the parents give affection and attention to each other, and the child is in this bad spot, just like in the advertisement where the child wants but fears both parents. The fears from the point of view of the father is that the father will harm them, kill them, or worse, castrate them, render them female. And Freud was relatively explicit about this. The danger from the mother is that she will swallow him, that she will absorb him, and own him as in a fairly slavish way. And again, what that means is basically losing one's masculinity, that she will have power over him. So he's really between a rock and a hard place. Here, he wants to be like dad, but dad's his rival, right? So in the phallic character, and in this kind of relates to the Oedipus Rex mythology, you have in the phallic character, and again, Freud is arguing that the normal course of development is the masculine, is the male. After I lay out the phallic character, I'll go back and we'll talk about what is supposed to happen to little girls. So he argues that fantasies that kids have, 4, 5, 6, 7, start to take on an openly sexual form. And modern development theorists are like, openly sexual? Kids at that age do start to have fantasy play. They do start to, quote, play house. They do, in the picture on the last slide, they start checking out each other's anatomy and making comparisons. It's all part of normal discovery of what the body is all about. They see adults, they see teenagers, they see people engaging in kissing and hugging, and sometimes they stumble into more than that. They are curious. And those things are real. For Freud, he saw that as, underlying all of that exploration were actual id impulses that were openly sexual. Modern developmental theorists dispute that there's no evidence to support that that's the case. Freud argued that at this stage, the erogenous zone shifts from toilet training and an emphasis on the anus to the actual genitals. So with kids at this age, it's normal for kids to touch themselves, for example, for them to put their hands in their pants. And generally, those touching experiences are exploratory. They're occasionally accidental. Freud saw them as sexual exploration. Modern developmental theorists are like, no, really no. The only time that becomes relevant in real children who are that age, when their behavior becomes more overtly sexual, that's associated with a history of overt sexual abuse. He described the phallic character, the process of becoming fixated at the phallic stage in the form of Oedipal complexes. Now, your authors mention this. The Electra Complex is often ascribed to Freud. Freud never used that term. He described female development in the phallic stage in a way that's convoluted and difficult, but he didn't use that terminology. That was later Freudian theorists who attached that label to it. But basically, the Oedipal in the male form, you have the male child attracted to the female parent, and their impulses, their desires, then get translated initially into a desire to kick out the male parent. Resolving this spurs, in a healthy way, resolving it for Freud, is to stimulate the growth of the superego. And, all of the societal messages that say, no, you don't kill your father and then marry your mother because that's super gross. So the world is kind of telling you, sex with your mom, bad idea. Now, number one, 4 to 6-year-old children, unless they have a history of sexual abuse, are likely not to have thoughts like that, period. In Freud's mind, though, he felt that the id impulses didn't have a buffer until the superego is developed. So once the superego comes in and says, no, those are not naughty, nasty, dirty thoughts, stop thinking them. And then this desire for the mom, as the superego emerges, becomes connected to the development of a guilt system that says, you're attracted to your mother, you're disgusting, right? So that inner voice starts to tell the boy, that's wrong, stop it. And to resolve it, the child has to go, okay, who's my ideal? Who am I going to shape myself after? And for boys,